Hey everyone, I'm Benjamin Norton. This is Multipolarista, and this is part two of a discussion that I had with the Pakistani scholar Junaid Ahmad. We talked about, in the first half, the US-backed coup against Pakistan's elected Prime Minister Imran Khan. And we talked about the geopolitical reasons behind this soft coup, this political coup that is very similar to the US-backed coup in Brazil in 2016. We discussed, for instance, that Imran Khan had helped to improve relations with Russia, which really angered the US. He refused to condemn Russia over its military intervention in Ukraine. He also signed economic agreements with Russia. Imran Khan likewise improved relations with Iran. He called for the US to lift its sanctions on Iran. And then, of course, Imran Khan was very close to China. China and Pakistan are very close allies. That's not necessarily new, but he did help to improve those relations. And we discussed how Imran Khan refused to normalize apartheid Israel. He strongly supported Palestinian liberation and resistance against Israeli colonialism. So, in the first part of this discussion, we addressed the reasons behind the coup, the large protests in Pakistan against this coup, the US government's role in overthrowing Imran Khan. In this second half here, I'm continued to be joined by Junaid Ahmad. He's a Pakistani professor and scholar and writer. And in this section, we talk about who Imran Khan is, what his politics are, his party, the PTI, the Movement for Justice, and we talk about the kind of two-party dictatorship that has dominated Pakistan for decades and how Imran Khan managed to break out of this two-party dictatorship. And then, of course, what the role of the military is, the very powerful military in Pakistan, which has backed coups throughout the history of Pakistan. And then we conclude the interview, the discussion, talking about what the future could look like for Pakistan after this soft coup and some of the largest protests in Pakistan's history. Those were the protests against the coup. So with all that said, without further ado, this is part two of my discussion here at Multipolarista with the Pakistani academic Junaid Ahmad. Can you briefly talk about the Sharifs? Because now we've seen that Sharif's younger brother, Nawaz Sharif, is the former prime minister of Pakistan. Because of the meddling of the military and the corruption, all this, Pakistan has had a lot of prime ministers. Sometimes they only serve a year or two and then they get removed. And so, for people who don't know, Nawaz Sharif served as prime minister 3 times, and really he dominated Pakistani politics for many years until Imran Khan kind of broke the back of that kind of two-party dictatorship you talked about. Before, you had the PPP, which is this kind of center-left party, which over the years has become very neoliberal, like a lot of older left-wing parties that had a left-wing history, but then in the 80s and 90s they became neoliberal. And so you had the PPP govern for a while. You mentioned the Bhutto family. Then I mentioned that there was a coup backed by the US of this very repressive right-wing dictator, Zia-ul Haq. And then after that, you've kind of had the Pakistani Muslim League, and there's two factions, the Q and the N faction. But this kind of right-wing neoliberal party, the PML, Pakistani Muslim League, has dominated Pakistani politics, and specifically the Sharif family. Before Imran Khan came to power, they have dominated politics, and it seems that Imran Khan is now going to be replaced by the younger brother of Nawaz Sharif. So can you explain what this family is, what their politics is, what their allegiances are?
Absolutely. Ben, I must first say that I wish that outlets like Democracy Now! Would do the type of research that you have done on the country. Even half the amount of research that you've done would be a great start. And we can get to why I say that in a minute. But yeah, it's as I was saying, these two political parties, the Pakistan Muslim League of the Sharif brothers and the Pakistani People's Party, have dominated the political life since the 1990s. Just one thing about the Pakistani People's Party. Now, as you say, this has moved from left to center, left to utterly neoliberal and corrupt. It was founded by the father of Benazir Bhutto, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, in the 1970s. Now, his name is important because Imran Khan has also referred frequently to him and his example and the horrible example made out of him as
The coup
Henry.
against him.
Yeah,
And the
absolutely.
execution.
Absolutely. So he was a quote unquote. I mean, this term is becoming so discredited. Populist leader. And he was very much he talked about kind of Islamic socialism and this type of thing, so and incredibly popular, particularly after a decade of military rule, which was ousted by mass protest, and of course following the horrible war in East Pakistan that led to the creation of Bangladesh. So the country was kind of hungry for something different, for something new, and he spoke about his slogan was roti, kapra, and makan, bread, bread, clothes, and shelter. Right? It was very much kind of a pro poor, and some of his policies did attempt to do that, to implement a more social redistributive agenda. However, his own feudal background very much constrained his own willingness to implement some fairly social democratic reforms in the country. However, it was all very much too much. It was too much for the military. It was too much for the many right-wing forces in the country. And it was too much, most importantly, for Washington. He was again standing out as a very independent leader of the global south, denouncing Washington, had denounced what they were doing in Vietnam and Indochina, had also held a massive Organization of Islamic Conference summit in Lahore, where forget about the kings, and he had Gaddafi there, Muammar Gaddafi, he had Yasser Arafat, he had these types of people there with him. And perhaps the biggest crime was that after India had established its nuclear program, he started to pursue a similar one inside Pakistan. And while all of these combined to...
Really briefly, and also Zulfikar Bhutto was seen as pro-Soviet. He tried to improve relations with the Soviet Union, which is another major no-no for the U.S., obviously.
Absolutely. I mean, that was very much part of it. Pakistan's, by the way, the relationship with China, you absolutely said it correctly, that this has been consistent across whatever government or regime, military, civilian, since 1962. I think they came together on the basis of kind of having a common enemy, which was India. There was the war with India over the border that China had. And then after that, good relations with Pakistan, consistently good. I mean, there's no ups and downs here. Like, this isn't like the relationship with the United States. This has been consistently a good relationship. And it was, in fact, Pakistan, which in the early 70s, which facilitated the beginning of the American relationship and engagement with China. People should remember that. They facilitated Nixon's trip to China and so on. But coming back to Bhutto, by the end, I mean, by 1976, 77, Henry Kissinger had written directly to Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, saying, if you do not desist from the nuclear program, we'll make a horrible example out of you. And they did. Through a judicial coup and execution later on, the military was able to launch a coup against him. General Zia-ul-Haq, who you spoke about earlier, one of the most brutal, vicious military dictators of the country, ousted him in a coup and then later on hanged him. And that was fully backed by the United States. So Imran Khan points to that he says that, of course, all sorts of low domestic forces, etc., may be opposed and so on. But something like this really happens when you have most likely Washington's hand in it. That's always attempts to kind of undermine, destroy any type of independent national project within Pakistan, or for that matter, any country of the global south. So he refers to what happened to Zulfikar Ali Bhutto as he refers to that in comparison to what's going on with him today. That's very ominous, but of course, I mean, these mass demonstrations aren't going to make it easy for his opponents to get rid of him. Sorry,
Yeah,
and I'm sorry. Coming back to the Sharifs.
Well, one second. Here's
ahead,
an article. This is an article that was published this March in the South Asian media. Foreign funds being used to attempt regime change in Pakistan, Imran Khan warns. This is from March 28th in the Print, which is an Indian media outlet, and they pointed out here. I mean, this was an incredible speech. This is a speech that Imran Khan gave to a big rally. And he talked about the evidence of foreign funds for the coup. He said some people are knowingly trying to topple the government. Of course, that's exactly what happened. And he later named the U.S. politicians involved. We'll talk about that in a second. But in regard to what you said, Junaid, I mean, this is a relevant quote. It's an incredible quote. This is what Imran Khan said a week before the coup to a big rally of his supporters. Quote, he said, the governments were changed with the help of people living in Pakistan, and recalled former Prime Minister Zulfikar Ali Bhutto's execution due to circumstances prevailing in 1979. And then here's the quote: "Our country was being threatened because of the deeds of our old leaders. The governments were changed with the help of people living in the country. Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, when he tried to bring a free foreign policy to the country." Now, I mean, that's a clear sign that he's telling his supporters that Bhutto was overthrown because of his, quote, free foreign policy. And of course, the implication is that Imran Khan was telling his supporters that he was also being overthrown because of his free foreign policy.
Absolutely, Ben. And let me just get to that in 1 second and first answer what you asked before in terms of the Sharif brothers, right? So, all of these people speaking now about how Imran Khan and his PTI, Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf, came to power with the help of the military. Well, the Sharif family and their coming to politics is directly a result of from the cultivation of under General Zia-ul-Haq and the military. There were nobodies before then, neither in politics nor even in business. And of course, through politics, they became one of the richest families in the country. So it was Zia-ul-Haq and his attempt to find some democratic cover, some civilian cover for his regime, which cultivated the House of Sharif, Nawaz Sharif's father, and of course his brother. So they came with the help of the military and the intelligence agencies, who consistently supported them throughout the late 80s and 90s in opposition to the Pakistan People's Party, right, which they were still afraid of until now. Of course, has become fully neoliberal. At that time, still, at least rhetorically, had a center-left agenda. So the Nawaz Sharif family completely supported, patronized by the military, and they they became one of the major political parties, the Pakistan Muslim League of the Nawaz group. And you're right, there's a Pakistan Muslim League Qaid group, which came into existence during Musharraf's period. Musharraf was looking for some politicians to give him some legitimacy, so he cooked up this PMLQ. But anyway, so it was through the support. They would be nothing without the support. They would be nothing in politics or in business without the support of the military throughout the 80s and 1990s. And you've seen Nawaz Sharif, the elder brother, being prime minister, and the younger brother, Shehbaz Sharif, being the chief minister of Punjab through much of this period. And right now, he, as you say, he is the most likely candidate for being prime minister of the country. His brother, incredible corruption, and is now indicted on so many accounts for quote unquote medical reasons. He left the country to England, and of course for medical reasons. And now he's ready to come back. All of a sudden, everything has improved. His platelet count, his red blood cells. It's quite hilarious. And so now he's making his return to the country. In addition,
well, Junaid, and of course the optics of this corrupt longtime former leader who has over $1 billion in wealth. I mean, he's a billionaire. And where is he residing? In the former colonizer of South Asia.
Yeah.
I mean,
which tells you a lot. Yeah. I mean, it tells you a lot. I mean, this is one of the things that Imran Khan was hitting home in that in his UN speech. What the look, our countries are maldeveloped, underdeveloped, because our elites can exploit them with your help, with your assistance. These are perfect examples. I mean, what is he doing there when he's plundered the country? Why is the so-called civilized West, so-called believes in rule of law and all of these things, and they're housing these criminals? And they did the same with the former leader of another political party from Karachi, the MQM, Altaf Hussain, sitting in England for the longest time. So Nawaz Sharif, went to England, and he's done this many times. Even when he was ousted in 1999, when Musharraf came to power, these guys never faced trial or anything. The Saudis, on his behalf, asked Musharraf, please let him go, and then he took refuge in Saudi Arabia. Now, some of these places, we often say, this is the last refuge for scoundrels in our country. Places like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, as you know, when Ashraf Ghani flew from fled Afghanistan, tried to go to one of these Central Asian countries. They said, look, we're not going to take you. And then he goes to the United Arab Emirates. So we have to understand these places.
And stole hundreds of millions of dollars.
Exactly. That's not an issue for these places, including London, it seems. So this is the record. I was going to say that in addition to his younger brother, he has groomed his daughter, Maryam Nawaz Sharif, to also succeed him in the party at some stage. She's been mobilizing, etc. So she's ready for her appointment as well. But this should give you a sense, and our audience a sense, Ben. I mean, how these political parties operate. These are the ones that are leading us to civilian democracy in the country. These huge kind of family dynasties, which these two are. It must be said, politics was used by them to plunder the country and make massive amounts of accumulated wealth. The House of Sharif and the House of Bhutto Zardari. Asif Ali Zardari, your viewers may or may not know and should know, was considered the most corrupt person in the country. He was the husband of the late Benazir Bhutto. And during Benazir Bhutto's time in power, they would call him, he'd go from Mr. 5%, 7%, 10%, maybe even more. But that would mean he would take a direct cut in any kind of business and transaction in the country, small or big, openly, flagrantly doing this. And of course, after Benazir's assassination, which he may or may not have a hand in, but it's clear that, when we ask, cui bono, who benefits from something, it was clearly him. This corrupt guy became the president of the country. So on the one hand, you have that and the House of Sharif, and these two families, lo and behold, are the two richest families in the country.
Yeah, and so Imran Khan comes to the scene by breaking that two-party dictatorship, and he creates this party. Again, it's important. The name is important. The Movement for Justice, the PTI, the Movement for Justice, right? And he is seen. We talked about he's seen as this figure who's called Taliban Khan, and not that's actually not a smear from the right-wing conservatives. That's from the kind of neoliberal elites who often are, to simplify it, my understanding of Pakistani politics, tell me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is that the PPP and these kind of technocratic neoliberal elites oftentimes they try to use more secular politics to win over voters, and then the PML, the Pakistan Muslim League, PMLN, they try to use kind of conservative identity politics and talk about Islam, but neither really offers any social justice or anything. And so you have Imran Khan comes to power with this preaching this kind of Islamic populism, fighting for justice for the oppressed and poor people. And he wins in 2018. And let's talk about what he's done. There are valid criticisms in your article that you published in Multipolarista. You talk about some valid criticisms, specifically, allegations of patriarchal views, also allegations of not being a very effective politician. That makes sense because he didn't have a lot of political experience. He was a cricket player. But aside from that, no politician is perfect. Obviously, there are valid criticism. Let's talk about what he's done in the past 4 years. And not just, of course, domestically, let's talk about his foreign policy and why you think he brought the wrath of the elites upon him.
Right. So yeah, no, I mean it's very important to get into this. I don't think I've written or said anything. I'm sure I haven't, that didn't entail significant criticisms of Imran Khan as well. But coming back to that the Taliban Khan thing, and the interesting thing with that is that on the one hand, the so-called liberal left, is speaking about him as Taliban Khan, and the religious right in the country is speaking of him as a Jewish agent. All right, so he had his former wife,
Oh yeah,
who
yeah.
his former wife Jemima Goldsmith, um, who's from England, and
Yeah.
and who they had a very amicable separation and divorce. It was, and she said it was clear that he was dedicated to something important, that is the political life in Pakistan. And that was too much for her. So which they have a very amicable relationship. In fact, she was one of the most outspoken opponents of drones, the drone program in Pakistan. In England, she mobilized lots of people came to Pakistan and speak. So but the fact that he was married to her made him some type of a Jewish agent. So let's be very clear. Whatever Islamic messaging he puts out, it's not like that's supported by the religious right in the country. Not at all. And this of course many of our liberal left friends won't want to admit, because they want to portray him as some torchbearer of the religious right, of militancy, of all of this. I mean, these guys want to kill him, and you're saying that it's really farcical. But
Well, one quick note for people who don't know: Jemima Goldsmith. I mean, she's a liberal journalist. She was an editor of the New Statesman, which is this kind of like center left British magazine. And I think this actually is an interesting point, because it says, at least for me, it says a lot about the politics of Imran Khan. He was kind of part of this kind of international cosmopolitan elite. I mean, he's very wealthy. I mean, he was an award-winning, very accomplished, very successful cricket player and team leader. And he was married to, this journalist, and lived, he had time living abroad in the West, right? But he decided to give that up to go get involved in Pakistani politics. And to me, that actually says something about him. He's not a leftist, but the fact is that this guy does have an ideology. He does believe in social justice, and he did give up this life as a wealthy, Pakistani in abroad, expat, right? He gave that up to come back to get involved to try to transform Pakistani politics.
No, Ben, I mean, this is absolutely the case. I mean, this is why he was welcomed into political life in the first place. Like, we should know. Let's have some perspective on this. A third party entering, sui generis, out of nowhere, in any political context, we should know that from the United States, elsewhere, is almost impossible, right? I mean, and actually winning and coming to power, where you have an established kind of two-party duopoly, that type of a system in place. So the reason he was welcomed is not just because he was this great cricketer and led Pakistan to a championship, was because that afterwards he took exactly what you described, his international standing amongst, yes, the kind of global, certain sections of global celebrities, the elites, and this type of thing. He took his standing and then brought it to Pakistan to do immense amount of fundraising. I remember, for example, someone like Princess Diana, when she was alive, brought her on so many trips to Pakistan, who then helped him. Of course, you probably know, Ben, she was then considered an outcast in the royal family as well, and many think who was murdered, assassinated by them as well. But he basically used the standing he had for fairly good purposes inside the country. There's no question about that, which is why he was able to make his dent into the political system, which again we should remember is nearly an impossible thing for any political context in any political country. So yeah, that was Imran Khan standing. But coming to what you're saying, when he comes to power and how his rule has been, look, on the domestic front, he inherited a country, completely impoverished, Foreign reserves were down to a low. A lot of money, as soon as he comes out, people don't realize a lot of the money of the elites immediately pulled out of the country, right? I mean, we wish we had capital controls here. We didn't. We don't. And so a lot of this money, we have some now, but at that point, when you have billions upon billions going outside of a country, a poor country like Pakistan, that has an impact on your country. So this is not to say that his economic governance of the country has been great. Not at all. I mean, he inherited a situation. He didn't have the greatest of advisors. His own kind of thinking on this, I mean, not very developed. So he, in fact, which he railed against before, in principle, he had to accept a loan from the IMF. Now, the problem that elites have had with Pakistan on the domestic front is that he hasn't implemented those austerity, quote unquote, austerity reforms harshly enough. So he had done so a little bit, but he takes like one step, quote unquote, forward, which is actually, a step backward in terms of its impact on the social majorities, but then, quote unquote, a step backward in which he then begins some type of a subsidy program. So he's done recently for fuel prices, for electricity. And so this is one of the reasons that's been boiling up for a while, is that no longer do the domestic elite, and especially the foreign elite and the IMF, and so that want to ram through this type of severe austerity program, no longer can they trust him anymore to implement that. So there's no question that it's he's not done much for the working poor in the country and those classes, but he inherited a horrible situation. Then COVID came, in which, of course, even friends at The Economist, this kind of reactionary magazine, even they ranked Pakistan.
As Lenin famously said, the voice of British millionaires.
Exactly.
Today, adjusted for inflation, that'd be British billionaires.
Right. So, even they had to acknowledge, well, Pakistan did a pretty good job during the whole COVID thing. They ranked it like number 2 or so on. And, I'm not saying necessarily that's because of some great policies of Imran Khan, but it came out better than a lot of countries. But of course, it had an impact. So, there's much to be desired from him on the domestic front, and much to be disappointed about. And part of that is what he's kind of admitting now, is that he says, I was too busy in a campaign project at that point in 2018, especially in 2018, when it's, when we were surprised that, look, we have a real chance of winning here. I didn't pay sufficient attention to some of the corrupt jokers and clowns that we got as part of the party. Now, I mean, many will find that incredulous, but some of us that also know that, he was, full campaign mode, and he did hand over some of these duties to others in the party. So he admits that this was one of the major mistakes, that we should not have relied on some of the so-called electables who decided to join the party. We should not have welcomed them into the party. And this is, in some ways, this has been a good experience for him. A lot of the traitors from within, the defectors within the party, have now been exposed. And so this was a huge mistake. It's like it's understanding that Imran Khan was not able to implement many of the things that he wanted to. And again, his platform, and you expressed it earlier, this idea of an Islamic welfare state. He keeps speaking about what the state that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, that he established a strong welfare state. I mean, who cares about whether he's accurate about the past? The point is, what is he saying about the present, and is it good or not? And if clearly, in a context like Pakistan, this is something progressive to move towards an Islamic welfare state, constantly speaking about the poor, the marginalized, and about a sense of justice, compassion, and mercy. Of course, to our neoliberal left friends in Pakistan, this is kind of such dangerous religious talk, and so on. You said earlier that they say things in a secular framing like the PPP, That's actually, actually they use quote unquote Islam as well when they need to. But of course, their messaging is not an Islam on the side of social justice. They're using it for all sorts of other ends, right? I mean, the PPP and this PMLN, and PPP has this historic, is aligned with the most right wing conservative group, the JUI in Pakistan, led by what they call Maulana Diesel, Maulana Fazlur Rahman, because he's hugely corrupt in the natural gas business. And so they are aligned with all sorts of these characters. It's the particular type of Islamic messaging that they despise when it comes to Imran Khan. And as far as many of our liberal secular elite, it's like what you say, that they cannot fathom the fact that someone who, was educated in the West and went to Oxford and had spent so much time abroad, that this guy would come back wanting to enter Pakistani political life, speaks to the values of the people, dresses like them, etc. They can't stand that. They're like, why? If you're coming, why aren't you speaking our vocabulary of kind of a neoliberal emphasis on the way we want to speak about development or human rights, etc.? Why aren't you speaking in our language? Why do you bring in Islam in all of this, right? And the fact is, he has been the most committed to interreligious pluralism in the country, right? I mean, he's restoring these Sikh temples, constantly speaking. Their narrative if even scrutinized by a 5-year-old, then it cannot stand. Of course, it's not scrutinized by anyone. They just get massive airtime, and the Democracy Now is a good example. But let me just also say that it was we also understood that Imran Khan, initially coming to power, look, he had made some problematic statements with regards to women, and yes, a very conservative notion, Islamic notion of women. But this was also an instance in which there was a lot of pushback from all sections of society on some of the things he said with regard to female sexual assault and this type of thing, that he was able to be pressured and change his views. I mean, I think he really understood it and then changed his views, which led him to be kind of one of the strongest proponents of very pro-women legislation, anti-domestic violence, anti all types of sexual assault. So, I mean, I think he also has learned from these things. So, I mean, it's important to maintain that critique, to push him and his party on these things. But it's also important to understand that's not the reason why elites want him out. That's not the reason why Washington wants him out. And those have to do with, as I said, on the domestic front, his insufficient obedience to that agenda, right? And which is manifested recently by implementing some subsidies for things which, the IMF has no time for. It's calling for the removal of subsidies. It's calling for more austerity. And on the international foreign policy front, as you say, Pakistan, one of the things, Pakistan was under enormous pressure by the Gulf countries, of course, by Israel and the United States, when that whole normalization drive began, right? When the United Arab Emirates, the Saudis were pressuring the
so-called Abraham Accords.
The Abraham Accords, I mean, between countries who were always, I mean, they called it, these kind of accords, peace treaties. These countries were never at war. These countries were always collaborating. Now it's just out in the open,
exactly,
between these Gulf monarchies and Israel. And so, but
Junaid, really quickly, for people who don't know, we should also provide important context that Pakistan has a very complex relationship with the Gulf monarchies, largely because, one, the Gulf monarchies are extremely wealthy and have given a lot of loans, especially Saudi Arabia, to Pakistan. And also because so many Pakistani migrant workers are in the Gulf, and they are often basically enslaved. They're treated in horrible conditions. They're trafficked. Their passports are taken from them. But there really is a threat that's power that the Gulf regimes hold over Pakistan, because if Imran Khan does something that angers Saudi Arabia or the UAE or something, they could threaten to expel those Pakistani workers, which means that the remissions that they send to their families, which is an important stream of income for Pakistani families and for the Pakistani economy, that could dry up.
Absolutely. I mean, and I'm glad you raised that, because that's such an important context to Pakistan's ability to maneuver and carve out an independent foreign policy, because I mean, this is part of the same architecture of international power and control. When we say Washington or the Gulf countries,
yeah, it's called
basically
imperialism.
the same. Right? It's
imperialism.
Exactly. Precisely, right? Exactly. And so during this quote unquote normalization process, in which the Gulf countries obviously were on board, and they were pressuring other Muslim countries. So they were able to succeed in the case of a country like Morocco, for example. But of course, Pakistan would be the big prize, right? I mean, Pakistan, this huge country, nuclear armed, that was the ultimate prize for Israel and the United States. And they wanted their intermediaries, the Gulf monarchies, to place that pressure. And there was immense pressure. And I remember, this is something that we were quite active in. We did so many kind of interviews, etc. And the reason was, Ben, to his credit, Imran Khan virtually stood alone amongst our ruling elites in opposing this. All of the opposition political parties more than willing to get on board. Our military elites, at least a significant section of them, also willing to play. Imran was opposed to it. And I remember this was such a tense couple of months in Pakistan, in which there was this discussion. They didn't outrightly refuse initially. I mean, Imran kept on making statements, but it was like still, and I did so many, programs and shows with all sorts of friends, we take Professor Ilan Pape or Professor Saad Abu Khalil, and all of these people opposed, who gave great critiques, and that we were able to provide to the Pakistani public. So to his credit, he maintained his basically his position on this question of normalization, which was the position of the Pakistani people. And so, that was it was a period of immense pressure on Pakistan. And I'm glad you raised that relationship with, say, Saudi Arabia as well as the UAE, where so many Pakistani workers are located, and a relationship in which the Saudis, will sell cheaper oil, will give loans, and that type of thing. All of these things, not only did the Saudis put in jeopardy then, that is, they were using these points as leverage, but this really came to head. And again, this was a core part of Imran's position on the international issues that made him such a target, was the emergence of a counter-hegemonic bloc within the Muslim world, where you had countries like Turkey, Iran, Malaysia, maybe even Qatar at that point, willing to come together. And it was no secret. These guys were trying to challenge the traditional Saudi-led hegemony that is often manifested through the Organization of Islamic Conference and other venues. And there was a very important summit in Kuala Lumpur in December 2019 that was being hosted by President Mahathir Mohamad, right? I mean, this incredibly kind of legendary figure in not only Malaysia, but in the Muslim world, who, it's claimed, and there's truth to it, obviously, that developed Malaysia, significantly over the past few decades. So, and who very much developed a very close personal relationship, a deep affinity for Imran Khan when he visited Malaysia. So Imran was going to be kind of one of the chief guests at this summit. Days before, he's summoned to Riyadh in Saudi Arabia and told in very explicit terms by Mohammed bin Salman, this leader of Saudi Arabia, that you're not to go there. And if you do, we're going to start deporting Pakistani laborers. We're going to end these loans, stop these subsidized loans. I mean, he went with the full 9 yards, and Imran had no, at that point, he had no option but to comply. So that was very much part of it. It's not only support for Palestine and these things. It is very much an attempt to be part of a counter hegemonic project within the Muslim world, which everyone knows cannot succeed without Pakistan's participation in it. So he was constrained by all of these things in terms of whether it's on Palestine, in which, to his credit, he never gave in to this point. We had an Organization of Islamic Conference summit just last month that Imran Khan hosted. Even in there, I think probably to the discomfort of many of his guests, again, he spoke about how we have failed to stop Israeli brutality against the Palestinians. So as I argue in the piece, had he not been so vocal on particularly the Palestinian issue, I'm not sure if he would be so much in trouble internationally. But it's been about a counter-hegemonic tendency within the Muslim world. It's been about speaking about global Islamophobia. And when he does so, it's not just kind of a rhetoric around, okay, stop hating or be or fearing Muslims. It's really about structurally, stop this kind of global system in which Islamophobia is one part of kind of a global racist, white supremacist project. So he speaks about it in far more structural terms than just kind of a visceral thing, which and one of the core parts about that, Ben, has been his rejection. Many of us know this very well. Many Muslims have become so fed up. This kind of idea of moderate Muslims and then radical Muslims. Of course, the moderate Muslims are you may have heard this, moderate Arab regimes, right? This has nothing to do with their theological orientation. It has to do with their political orientation towards Washington.
Exactly.
Right? And so his and at the UN stage, kind of rejecting these things, we're used to kind of Muslim leaders just playing nice, being whatever. His open rejection of this imperial language and vocabulary to describe Muslims. This really angered and made anxious many of the Western capitals. So Ben, there's so many of these factors that when combined together, it's not very difficult to see why he would have so much opposition from those places which prefer some type of a very feeble, compliant, subservient, servile regime in one Muslim country or the next, or for that matter, throughout the global South.
You mentioned, just so we can, I like to get into the geopolitics of these things and understand, here's a map for people watching and not just listening. There's a map here of Pakistan. And my understanding is that a lot of these drone strikes were in what's called the FATA, not like the Palestinian FATA, FATA, the federal tribal areas, right? That's where a lot of these protests were. And my understanding is that in Pakistani politics, it's very regionalized, right? So you have the PPP based traditionally in their own area in Sindh, I think, right?
That's right.
And then Punjab has traditionally dominated the politics. Yep. And my understanding is that the tribal areas have historically been completely ignored by main major politicians. And Imran Khan, when he came into power in 2018, he was trying to bring in these populations who had historically been not only ignored by the central government, but bombed by the central government. And that, I think, partially explains his mass popular base, right?
Right. Well, Ben, not only ignored, but because of in some ways being ignored like that, therefore fairly autonomous. So, which is why when we say FATA, federally administered tribal areas, that gives a different kind of connotation. Actually, the federal government didn't have much to do with them. And for sure, there's incredible lack of development, investment, and that type of thing, which surely needs to happen. But of course, they also then developed a culture of living autonomously, having their own autonomy, and so on. And they're fine. They never bothered the country never bothered them. And so all of a sudden, the United States is pressuring the Pakistani military to go into those areas in these heavy military operations, bombed them, and so on. This was just outrageous, right, Ben? We've never had something like this in those areas. Of course, you're absolutely right. It began with American drone strikes in those areas, and that was actually, you're absolutely right. That's where the momentum of support came from Imran Khan, certainly in those areas, but also throughout the country that also recognized this as not only immoral, but a gross illegal violation of Pakistani's sovereignty. And I remember during that time, we hosted people like Medea Benjamin, the good friend Kathy Kelly had come. I mean, part of these marches, along with Imran Khan, against drone strikes, and actually going to those areas, which was incredibly difficult and dangerous. So you're absolutely right. And I mean, just really quickly, I think it's probably important also for people listening and watching this to understand that when Imran Khan came into political life, he came with a background of incredible credibility in the Pakistani population, and respect for not only, of course, winning the cricket championship for Pakistan in 1992. He was the well-respected captain, but after that, becoming one of the biggest philanthropists in the country, opening up the first free cancer hospital in all of Asia, I don't know, maybe even in the world, named after his mother who had died because of cancer, and involved in all sorts of other charitable stuff. So when he came to politics, this person was incredibly respected. You know, not an ounce of corruption or anything like that. And he was also someone who said that he decided to go into politics because he realized that his charitable work, as needed as it was not going to transform a system which continuously will produce that mass poverty and immiseration. So that was the reason he went into politics. And so you're absolutely right. I mean, he started PTI, the political party, in 1997. And after 2001, what his main popular mobilization was against the war on terror, because, as we all know, that was the major phenomena consuming all of our lives at that point in Pakistan, and therefore
thousands of Pakistanis died. Thousands.
Absolutely. Of course, I mean, you know, as one of your great politicians in the U.S. said once, or one of the Bush administration officials, we don't do a body count. You know, when it comes to the same applies here. I mean, in those tribal areas, and it was very unfortunate. But Imran Khan, stuck to his guns. The idea that this military just kind of loved Imran Khan and therefore brought him to power, no. And I mean, they despised him because it was very clear that at least the top brass of the military, they're obviously complicit in the war on terror, and of course they undertook their own massive military operation. So, all of these people, there's now kind of a realization of the rights of these people, of the Pashtun people, and so on. Imran Khan was the first one speaking about this issue. So I think that all of these issues throughout the war on terror got him into trouble with Washington. And it's important to say what I just said right now is that it's not that the Pakistani military loved him. It's just that the level of corruption in the opposition political parties was even bad for their own the political economy of their own interests in the country. And whether it's the feudal dynasty of the House of Sharif or the feudal dynasty of the House of Bhutto Zardari, these are the two political parties, the Pakistan People's Party and the Pakistani Muslim League of the Nawaz Sharif group, the two dominant political parties which have completely controlled Pakistani political life throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, basically up until when Imran Khan came to power in 2018. So his movement on the foreign policy front was opposing the war on terror, opposing conflict and violence. I mean, to this day, he says he's more than willing to be a partner in peace, but not in conflict. And the other domestic part was getting rid of these thoroughly corrupt political parties that had just plundered and pillaged the country since the 1990s. This is not disputed, right? It's just a question of saying, well, I mean, no one can cover this up. It's just like, well, we hate Imran Khan more. No one denies the fact. And so he wanted to not only oppose these corrupt political system, but open it up so it can get beyond these two, so-called democratic political parties, which are internal feudal family dynasties. When Benazir Bhutto was assassinated, and as much as obviously that was incredibly tragic, one of the prime ministers of Pakistan, and very well known as one of the first women heads of state in a Muslim country, when she was assassinated, she had written in her will that she's going to bequeath her political party to her son, and until he comes to age, to her husband, the most corrupt person in Pakistan, Asif Ali Zardari. So this is sadly the type of political climate that he was trying to challenge Imran Khan when he comes to power. And just one point about this idea that the military, brought him to power and was so supportive of him and so on. You see, in Pakistan, we think, basically, I'm speaking about our intellectual class, elites of the country, think that because a civilian prime minister comes to power who may share some foreign policy objectives at that particular time with the military, therefore it makes him a puppet of the military, them in cahoots and so on. I often say that if that's the case, then virtually every U.S. administration that I know of was what they call the hybrid regime, a civilian military. That is to say, I mean, it's very few American presidents that I can think of that defy the national security state, that defy the Pentagon and the deep state.
None. I mean,
right, none.
There was one. His name was JFK, and we saw what happened there.
Right. Exactly, right. So the fact that he shared aims of of the United States getting out of Afghanistan soon, etc., all of these things, and maybe the military at that particular point had agreed with those ideas as well. Everyone thought, well, there's such he's a puppet basically of the military. He's serving their agenda. Well, I mean, these people must have been very disappointed when he became incredibly outspoken on issues which the military was like, whoa, you're going too far, and it's come to head here. You're absolutely right. I mean, here we had such like open sedition by the military chief of army staff. Imran Khan is the elected prime minister. He has articulated Pakistan's policy on these questions. The chief of army staff comes on TV the next day and addresses huge audiences saying the exact opposite, that this is wrong. The Russian invasion is wrong. Our relations with the U.S. are great, have always been great. Basically begging the U.S. that please don't abandon us. Consider Imran Khan as this this outlandish character that hopefully we'll get rid of soon. So he was effectively begging the United States, don't abandon us yet. We still have a lot to offer you, and so on. So this was a joke, Ben, that he was a puppet of the military. His positions. Tell me when the Pakistani military have ever spoken so loudly on Palestine, on other issues of global Islamophobia, of the elite plunder of countries of the global South, and with the collaboration of obviously global elites of the global North. I mean, this is not the military's agenda at all.
Well, this has been an excellent conversation. I mean, I kept you so long, and it's very late there, I know, or very early/late in the morning. But I want to wrap up with one final question, because we've hinted at it here, and that is the left in Pakistan. We talked about Imran Khan's ideology. He has this kind of populist social justice politics, which is important, but he's not a leftist. I mean, he doesn't. I mean, he does talk about the importance of helping the poor and welfare and all those things, but he's not talking about capitalism. He's not talking about challenging, the billionaire oligarchs. There is a left in Pakistan, but, it's very small. And, I know some people from the Awami Workers League and all of these movements, and like there are some good groups, but being realistic, my understanding is that they're very small, and there's a lot of divisions within the Pakistani left. So let's just conclude talking about that, because we also talked about the problem in the Pakistani left of there is this kind of elitism sometimes, because the impression is that a lot of poor and working people are very religious and conservative, and therefore, they're seen as supposedly backward or whatever. So there's this very antagonistic relationship, in my understanding, in Pakistani politics between the left and Islam sometimes, although there are Islamic socialists. But it seems to me that from the friends I've talked to on the Pakistani left, that there's a struggle of trying to square that circle, of trying to find a way to complement socialism through like Islamic socialism. And I mean, whatever, maybe this is me imposing my foreign understanding, but let's just conclude here talking about the situation with the left, because unfortunately, it seems like some of them have actually kind of been supporting this coup and basically allying with the US, which is sad to see.
No question about it, Ben. I mean, that's the saddest thing, obviously, for me personally, is always identified of someone of the left. Look, from the beginning, there have been many reasons, even not related to what we've been speaking about here in terms of foreign policy or domestic policy. There was what we have coined Imranophobia right from the beginning. I mean, actually, even before he came to power, again, it was this discomfort with a person expressing strong views of social justice, but sometimes doing it with a Muslim framing, with an Islamic framing of these things. So there was, again, a great discomfort for liberals and people on the left, thinking that this was okay, some kind of a right-wing expression of the traditional religious clergy and that crowd in Pakistan, which of course it hasn't been. If that was the case, he wouldn't be hated by all of them. So there was that. As I said before, it was an inability to understand, or an unwillingness to even give a chance to someone who doesn't, again, speak or behave like they think he should have, being in the West and so on. So there was a deep Imranophobia right from the beginning, and it must be said that many sections of the left in Pakistan are Islamophobic. I mean, I don't think that should be a surprise to anyone. I mean, just as many in the West are obviously, even within the liberal left, can be Islamophobic. I mean, I have to say this before we conclude, but the recent interview last week with Democracy Now!, trying to understand the situation in Pakistan, unfortunately, they got one of these very deeply kind of Islamophobic native elite Orientalist in Pakistan, who basically said either there's us kind of liberal, human rights friendly civil society folks, or there's the Imran Khan Taliban-like individuals. I mean, a grotesque kind of falsehoods that were being spouted, but could get away with. And I'm saddened that Democracy Now! Would not do more research about these things, and that they would fall into these, horrible stereotypes about not just Khan, but about Pakistan in general. So it's sad to have our much of the left that often buys into these stereotypes, and what they don't understand, at least many of them, some of them are trying to, is that, look, sometimes a faith-affirming, discourse or faith-based discourse on social justice should also be part of the general movement of social justice. I mean, just the same way it was in Latin America in terms of liberation theology. No one's arguing that Khan has this. I don't think Khan has even a complete understanding of what he's trying to articulate. I think that has just been developing. I think that is a legitimate critique. And even through this process, I think he's kind of understanding, like, okay, what are the limitations of what I've done, both the theory and the praxis. So I think those criticisms are fair. The problem is many on the left don't even want to provide a space for social justice movements, often articulating them within some type of a religious vocabulary. That doesn't mean, the problem is we consider any and all such sorts of expressions as right-wing, reactionary, exclusive. That's an incredibly impoverished way of understanding these movements. And the final thing, Ben, I'll say is that it's incredible. It befuddles me, bewilders me how so many people were willing to support all sorts of reactionary tendencies as part of the agency of, say, the Syrian people. Remember our great moderate rebels.
Exactly.
These were Al-Qaeda and other reactionary forces more than willing to brook no criticism of them, defend them uncritically as the agency of the Syrian people, the voice of the Syrian people, the revolution. And Khan, they consider this kind of great reactionary, etc., that we must oppose at any cost. I mean, look at this, but Democracy Now!, as you know very well, incredibly supportive of what's going on in Syria, unwilling to listen to criticisms of what was the quote unquote the moderate rebels. But here, about Khan, oh wow, he said he referred to Islam in some of his speeches. He must be condemned as this kind of great defender of terrorism. It's such a farce, Ben. I mean, it requires just a little bit of scrutiny to expose this. And so it's sad for me to say that, yes, I think dominant sections of the left, which again, they often are very close, their social, cultural background to just liberals in the country. I think that unites them sometimes. They're kind of their social, cultural antagonism towards some of the kind of more faith-based, faith-affirming, faith-based mentality of the people, their values, and so on. So, which doesn't make them right-wing. This is what we need to understand. Which doesn't make them automatically right-wing. These people, if you see some of the images and videos, you see all types of people in these protests, right? We don't see all the women in burqas. They'll be in jeans. They'll be in whatever. No one is. So it is an absolutely caricature to describe the people that have been supportive of this project of Khan. It may not even be individually of Khan, but it's a tendency within Pakistan to speak to the powers that be, to perhaps try to develop an alternative project, to define them as kind of these reactionary right-wing folks, and absolutely caricatured falsehood. So I think that it's important for us to understand that yes, even the so-called Pakistani left can get it wrong sometimes, and some of them may get it right. But I think we have to be, particularly, folks sitting in the West, have to really understand that Pakistan right now is not this kind of simplistic country of this divided by, okay, we have these enlightened liberals and these hordes of kind of religious and conservative right-wing types. It's far more complex than that. And I hope that people will learn from you, Ben, in how to capture that complexity.
Well, and you as well. I hope people watching and listening to this will have learned a lot. I've certainly learned a lot from this excellent conversation. I'll just say on the final note here that, I have friends who are in the Awami Workers' Party, and I respect them, and they certainly know more about Pakistani politics than I do, but it is pretty distressing to see the Awami Workers' Party, this left-wing party in Pakistan, support the coup. And I've seen this again and again, where, there's left-wing groups that end up allying with imperialism, and oftentimes they don't realize it. You talked about Syria. I mean, how many people who call themselves leftists and socialists ended up supporting imperialism's attempt to destroy the post-colonial Arab nation of Syria? I mean, that a country that was colonized just a few decades ago, and they try to recolonize it again. But
absolutely,
I mean,
it's remarkable how these types of, they're more than willing to ally themselves with utterly reactionary, sometimes fascist forces. I mean, look at what's going on in Ukraine, right? I mean, it's incredible. Whether it's in Syria, or Ukraine, these reactionary forces we have no problem with. But yeah, when it comes to a character like Khan, he's the most reactionary thing we've ever seen. I mean, it is really farcical, Ben. And again, I have great friends in the Awami Workers' Party. It's probably the party I respect the most in this. But it's amazing how they can't that these two things must be mutually exclusive. That yes, of course, we can criticize Khan for policies, but that doesn't mean there's not a real attempt by Washington and powers that be in Pakistan to get rid of him. I mean, it's like it has to be one or the other, and so they think that that the fact that they're critical must also that there cannot be any other, there cannot be powers that want him out, which is absurd.
Well,
You don't
and
have
it
to. You
also
don't have to be a revolutionary. You don't have to be a revolutionary leftist to be opposed by Washington. That's something they should know.
of course.
Very well.
Well, it's also important to keep in mind that just because he doesn't have this coherently developed anti-capitalist ideology doesn't mean that he also doesn't have a massive popular movement behind him, as we see in these large protests. And you have to be with the people, right? And this is a popular movement of, not entirely, but of many working people and oppressed people who see a leader that for the first time feels like he's speaking for them, for the poor and oppressed. I mean, it's called the Movement for Justice. That's the name of the party. I mean, it's not a coincidence. And it reminds me of, in Latin America, this isn't really that big of a debate anymore, but the question of religion. You mentioned liberation theology. I mean, I'm in Nicaragua. In the Sandinista movement, Christianity has always been a very important element of Sandinismo. From the very beginning, there were priests who were guerrillas who were martyred, who were killed in the revolutionary struggle. And they said, Jesus was a communist, Jesus was a socialist. And of course, if we look at the Black liberation struggle in the United States, pretty much every major Black liberation leader in modern history of the U.S. was religious. I mean, Malcolm X, MLK, there's so many of them. So it makes sense that religion is going to play an important role, and it can play a progressive role in these struggles. And I've seen
that's the Islamophobia of this thing, Ben. I mean, we're more than willing to concede that there could be this wonderful Gandhi, the Martin Luther King. They played these great roles. The religion played a great role in that case. Even when I visited Cuba, Ben, it was amazing. I mean, some of our meetings that we had was in a church, and I'd be like, because of my own kind of experience, right, of the left in the Muslim world, which is, I'd be like, wow, okay. I mean, this is not an issue, right? It's not like a problem in these things. So this is something very unique, I think, to the Muslim experience right now. This idea, and they've kind of bought, the entire Islamophobic Orientalist narrative, right? Anything about Islam must be backward and reactionary, right? So the only way that we can have a proper left progressive narrative is that we effectively get rid of Islam. And you're absolutely right that it's so very different in, say, Latin America and other parts of the world. So I think this is something that I hope our friends within the left will realize, to kind of understand how faith plays a very important part of our societies, and that it is not necessarily a reactionary impediment to our progressive movement.
Yeah, I mean, Cuba is a unique example because they had a violent revolution, and they had a Marxist-Leninist model. But in Venezuela, the Chavista model is very interesting. Christianity is an important part of Chavismo, and every time you go to a pro-government rally in Venezuela, there's always signs and flags of this evangelical party, which is pro-Chavista. So religion's very complicated, and it reminds me also of, we were talking about Iran and Shia liberation theology, right? And Hezbollah and these groups that are motivated by this very progressive, revolutionary understanding of helping the oppressed and fighting the oppressor. And I mean, that's common throughout the world, and Pakistan's no exception. So I know I said that was the last question, but I swear, actually, I have one final short question because we're at 2 hours, and I know you probably need to get some sleep.
No, Ben, I hope you edit some of this. I don't know. I've been just going on and on right now, kind of.
No, it's a great conversation. I think people will really like it. So the last question I have here, which is a kind of provocative question that I don't want to ask you to try to predict the future with a crystal ball or anything, but do you think that if Imran Khan is overthrown, it looks like right now that it's going to be difficult for him. The military is threatening him, although there are these massive protests. We saw what happened in 2002 when the U.S. backed a coup in April 2002 against Hugo Chavez, and he was ousted for a few days, but then he came back because the people demanded him, and they filled the streets. So, I mean, we'll see what happens in Pakistan, but let's say that Imran Khan is ousted. I've already seen people, my Pakistani friends of mine, say that he'll come back, and he'll come back even stronger. What do you think about that?
Well, Ben, from this is just the immediate reaction to what's happened. For people who are on the side of Khan and BTI, it's pretty inspiring what has happened. I mean, throughout the countries. I mean, many of us did not even expect this. So what we have seen, this kind of popular protests and uprising throughout the country, peaceful, it should be remembered, before our Western friends say, oh, this is some Muslim violent uprising or anything. Peaceful demonstrations throughout the country. We weren't expecting this, and I don't think neither was the Chief of Army Staff and the military top brass or the opposition parties. Now, the vote of no confidence has taken place, and Imran Khan is no longer the prime minister. However, what if these protests are sustained and that momentum sustained? Then this could force whatever new government now comes to place through this vote of no confidence to call for early elections, to be forced to have early elections. So I think this is the big question right now, that if these protests sustain themselves, the government will have no choice but to call early elections. And I think that we can expect that to be beneficial for Imran Khan, considering the popular support, considering his commitment now to purge the party of all of these so-called electables that were also utterly corrupt, and to an extent prevented him from trying to implement the kind of social justice agenda that he wanted to. Again, this is yet to be seen. I don't want to be misunderstood as saying, well, Imran Khan is going to come back with a magical formula for social justice or anything. We hope that people push him towards that agenda, and it seems right now, the people of Pakistan, a large proportion of them are on the side of Pakistan. And this brings me to kind of the final point. Many of our friends in the West and the United States, in the left, continue to speak about hearing the voices of our comrades in Pakistan, the left. I encourage them to also listen to the voices of the people of Pakistan that have come out right now. No one is calling for kind of unconditional, blind support of Imran Khan, but at least listen to what the people are saying, and not necessarily who you consider the left to be the sole voice of what's going on in Pakistan today.
Yeah, absolutely. And fortunately, we have people like you, Junaid, who can help translate some of what's going on. Unfortunately, the English language coverage of Pakistan in the Western media is often very impoverished. It's very biased, and not only biased, it's also just very superficial. There's not much coverage, and if there is coverage, it doesn't go much into depth. So that's why I'm grateful that you gave me so much time and you stayed up so late. I know, I know you're fasting and it's Ramzan there, so hopefully it wasn't too hard to stay up. I guess right now, what is it, like 7 a.m. there, or 8 a.m.?
Well, the energy from what's happened today, and even more so the joy of the conversation with you has given me the energy to continue this conversation. It's a very exciting exchange with you, Ben. So I'm very grateful.
Yeah, well, I'm equally grateful. And for those who are listening or watching, we are speaking with Junaid S. Ahmad, and you can go to his article at multipolarista.com. This is his author page, and I translated his piece into Spanish. And I will tell you, by the way, Junaid, that your piece went around Latin America. I saw people sharing it to understand what's going on, because the Spanish language coverage is also not very good. So Junaid, he's a professor. He teaches religion and world politics, and he's the director of the Center for the Study of Islam and Decoloniality in Islamabad, the capital of Pakistan. Junaid, if people want to find more of your work, where can they find you?
Well, I mean, they can find me all over the place. So, I mean, I regularly write stuff for Counterpunch. They can find me on Counterpunch, many of the sometimes Consortium News. Even on our old friends at the Gray Zone. And remember, so I have a bunch of articles scattered, particularly on this issue, on a variety of alternative media, left-wing media.
Great. Well, it was a pleasure. And I'm going to divide this into two parts. And one part will be focused specifically on the coup and all of that. And the other part will be focused more on Imran Khan and Pakistani politics. But I mean, I learned a lot. It was a great interview. And I hope everyone watching and listening learned a lot. If you want to support this show, you can go to patreon.com/multipolarista, or you can support at multipolarista.com/support for people who want to maybe donate through PayPal or anything. And I'm going to definitely keep in touch with Junaid, and I'm going to keep track of what's going on in Pakistan and hope for the best. So, Junaid, thanks a lot. Ramzan Mubarak, and keep in touch.
Thank you, Ben. This was an absolute pleasure.
The pleasure is all mine.